Welcome to the electronic archive of presentations from Performance Incentives, the Growing Impact on American K-12 Education, a national conference hosted at Peabody College of Vanderbilt University in 2008. The conference was sponsored by the National Center on Performance Incentives, a research and development center funded in part by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. You're watching a video presentation from a panel on the legal and political dynamics of teacher compensation reform in American education. Paul Teske, a professor of public affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver, will first summarize major findings and policy implications identified by the authors of the 3 papers commissioned for this panel. Each author will provide a short commentary which includes remarks by Professor James E. Ryan, the William L. Matheson and Robert M. Morgenthau Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law, on the legal dimensions of performance incentive policies in education. Professor Dan Goldhaber, a research professor at the University of Washington, on the politics of teacher compensation reform, and Dr. Jane Hannaway, director of the Education Policy Center at the Urban Institute, on the interplay between emerging policy focus on teacher performance incentives and the response of teachers' unions.
I moved to Denver about 4 years ago from New York, and at the time ProComp was sort of percolating, and as someone interested in education policy, I wanted to learn a little about it. And I was lucky enough to learn more about it and get involved with 2 of the critical people in making ProComp happen, Brad Jupp, who used to be with the teachers union in Denver and now works for DPS, and Phil Gonring, who with the Rose Foundation was the philanthropic support that was pretty critical to making ProComp happen. And so we actually wrote a book, which I'll shamelessly self-promote here to an interested audience, that came out of Harvard Press a few months ago on the story of ProComp. And it's there's no Greek letters in it. It's actually, I think, a pretty interesting story of how it happened. It's not an evaluation of the program. It doesn't make the case that ProComp is the perfect solution to pay for performance or merit or market-based compensation, but it does tell the story of how it happened. And of course, this panel on the legal and political dynamics of pay for performance is in some ways I see as a broader panel. I mean, we've had some pretty technical issues and heard from a lot of very good economists about how to measure the things we want to measure and what correlates with what. And now we're going to kind of step back a little bit and ask what does the landscape look like, both politically and legally, for further advancement of pay for performance type compensation plans. And there are 3, I think, terrific papers that are going to do that. At this point, I see my role in this somewhat reversed format of presenter going first. I'm going to be a little bit less, provide a little less fidelity to the papers perhaps than Cynthia did in the previous panel, and summarize some of the elements of it pretty quickly. And I apologize if I do some injustice to the papers, but the authors will have time to correct me and fill in the gaps and nuances that I do miss. I also just want to set the stage a little bit, because I think one of the points of this conference and one of the reasons you're all here, I think, is that we all kind of expect pay for performance plans to take off. And political scientists like to study this phenomenon in the kind of diffusion of innovation, a kind of S-curve, where you're at the bottom of the S, and then you suddenly accelerate into this phase where lots of districts and states are adopting something new, and then it kind of plateaus. And people have studied that, for example, the evolution of charter schools, from the first ones in Minnesota in the early 1990s to 40 states having it now, and that sort of takeoff period. And I think one of the questions is kind of, are we at the beginning of a takeoff period? And I think some people may have thought we were at the beginning of a takeoff period in the mid-1980s on this same question, and it didn't happen. It just sort of bounced around a little bit, and so I'm not sure if we are or we aren't, but I think that's one of the questions. And if it is a kind of national, is it a national diffusion with a lot of attention being paid both from the top down national levels to the local levels, or is it really a context of every state and every district really matters the most, and it'll be a political discussion and battle to some extent in each state and each district, and who knows how that will turn out. I think a second important question, and these questions I think cut across the papers, and I hope that each of the paper authors will offer their their own insights, even more than what's in the paper on these questions, especially since it's the last sort of Burroughs session. But if you are an advocate of pay-for-performance plans and trying more experiments, how do you get around some of the remaining barriers? And I think those barriers are partly political, they're partly technical. We've heard a lot about the technical issues, and they're partly legal. And I think in this panel, for the first time, we're going to hear about some of the legal issues, which are quite interesting. And so the papers, in some ways, compared to some of the previous panels, involve a kind of softer discussion, not a lot of econometrics in them, although each of them does bring some hard evidence and data to bear that I think is very useful and very important. So I'll turn first to the Hannaway Rotherham paper, and one of the things that they point out that I think is very helpful is that teachers traditionally have had a lot of control over their work, and not a lot of evaluation, and not a lot of perhaps formal evaluation. Of the kind that the new accountability regimes have been putting into place. And even though for many of us it seems like those accountability regimes have been in place for a while, it's relatively new to the teaching culture and the teacher profession. And as we know, in many of the kind of evaluations that do exist, and there certainly are evaluations, they tend to not differentiate very much between the quality of teachers or the outcomes, and most teachers often get evaluated as satisfactory by their principals or by their superiors in these kinds of evaluations. They also point out that there's at least two ways that pay-for-performance type plans can change the landscape, and we talked about this a fair amount, but one is certainly the motivational effect and the teaching harder or smarter kind of element, if that exists, and I think we've thrown some degree of question into that during the last couple of days. But the second, which I think is more important, is the cultural effect, and others have put this more as the recruiting effect. I think it's related to that, but it's also a question that came up a little bit in the last panel of how does this affect teaching as a culture? How does it affect organizations that deal with that when we're thinking about differentiating compensation and performance in different ways? They also point out that pay for performance, a lot of plans tried in the past didn't succeed, and those of you that have looked at the history of this know that that's true, but what's maybe different at this point in time is that we, through NCLB and other mechanisms, we have a lot more data out there. Again, we've heard the details of some of the problems with the data and using it in different dimensions, but there is definitely better data out there and more demand to use that data from policymakers, and so there would seem a good chance in that regard. They also highlight the obvious issue in some ways about the political barriers to pay for performance, and typically that's been if not outright opposition, at least skepticism and concern among the teachers union, and there's been a lot of variation there, and that's one of the reasons Denver was so interesting, is that the union worked this through. But they highlight what they would suggest are four legitimate concerns that I think have come up a lot in the discussion in the last 2 days. One is the fact that a lot of teachers aren't tested, and this was eye-opening to me in terms of the context of ProComp, where only about 35% of the teachers have a state test against which to be tested, and the other 65% don't, and you need another, if you're going to do something that relates to student achievement, you need some kind of new test or other way to assess them. And again, that becomes, I think, as we've discussed, a bigger problem at the middle school and high school level, where teachers aren't teaching everything, and it's hard to know who to hold responsible for what's going on. A second legitimate concern is the possible distortion of patterns of instruction, the kind of teaching to the test, or in this case, teaching to the reward, so that you get tunnel vision to try to focus on the things that get you the most reward. And again, if that's the right stuff, and we've measured it right in terms of student achievement or whatnot, that's a good thing. But if it's only a narrow slice or a subset of what we want students to be getting through their K-12 education, then it's going to distort that pattern. The third is the individual zero-sum kind of notion, that there might be some competition among teachers if there is a reward system or a bonus system that only some teachers can get and others can't. And I think I'll come back to this in a minute, but I think it's kind of a notion that there will be destructive competition among teachers if you give individual level rewards and you have it as a kind of zero-sum mechanism. The fourth one is the fairness of the reward measures. Are they fair? Are they rewarding the right teachers in the right ways for the right things? And I think those are generally things that we've talked about in the last couple of days. The Hannaway and Rotherham paper also reviews the five major programs, and we've seen this yesterday to some degree in the Coppage paper and others. One of the things that I liked a lot that they they highlighted is one thing we discussed in the book too, which is that whatever lessons one draws from ProComp, it was a 7-year process, and an important part of it was the process, and there was a 4-year pilot, and it's not clear that just importing that or Xeroxing the ProComp plan and putting it in your own district is going to work or is a good idea, but working through the process is clearly important. Moving to the Goldhaber paper, which is also full of wonderful insights, and again, I encourage you to get it off the web and read it. I pulled out one quote, which is, "Yet the politics of teacher reform pay are complicated." And I think there's no question that that's true based on the discussion that we've been having for the last 2 days. He also provides a very good and concise review of some of the trends we've been talking about, some of the problems with the current pay structure. And we've had this discussion about maybe the perfect pay for performance plan that may be out there being the enemy of the good. And we have a pay plan now that may or may not be the best that we can do. The Goldhaber paper also talks about the union issues and breaks out a little bit the difference between the NEA and the AFT on this, and suggests that the AFT has been more supportive of what's often called combat pay, the higher pay for working in schools that are more difficult or with more at-risk kids. The Goldhaber paper also introduces some new, or at least new to me, data on Washington State teachers, asking them what they support in terms of pay for performance type plans, and finds support for this combat pay notion, a lot of positive support for that, some mixed support for, sorry, on the wrong slide, mixed support for extra pay for accreditation and hard to fill subjects, and finally, opposition to pay that's tied to student achievement. I think that fits pretty well with the Brian Jacob findings from Hillsborough County yesterday. Maybe not exactly, but it seemed like there was a lot of overlap in where the support was and where it wasn't. And I guess, as an editorial comment along the way here, I feel like I haven't heard anything in the last 2 days that seemed negative about combat pay. I mean, I guess if the teachers seem to like it, and there seems to be some evidence that it's not harmful from some of the papers that we've seen in the last few sessions, it would seem like that's a intelligent thing to do more of, maybe provide bigger incentives for. And Dan talks about this a little bit in the paper, and I talked with him at dinner last night, and sort of why doesn't that happen more? And his very smart answer is, well, because maybe the higher income neighborhoods within big school districts don't want their best teachers being incentivized to the low income parts of the school, school district, which is a different kind of political problem, right? It's not the classic management labor politics that's involved there, but it's sort of different socioeconomic strata in the same district. That seems to me a thorny problem, but probably resolvable. And if we really do care about the teacher gap in at-risk schools, that would be, I think, one place to focus a lot of attention. I have to say also, I think everybody comes to pay for performance with their own lens. And my lens from studying ProComp is about that, and we have lots of school district and teacher people who I'm certain have a certain lens on this. We've heard from a lot of economists about how they think about it. And when I was early on working on the book with Phil and Brad, I mentioned, well, a lot of this pay for performance happens in higher ed. I mean, I'm a professor. I worked in higher education for 20 years. And isn't that translatable into the K-12 environment? And I recognize there are differences. We get rewarded more for our research than our teaching, and God knows there's a whole question about how we would measure the quality of higher ed teaching that's, I think, beginning to get on the agenda, but will also be very difficult. But the hard to fill, the market-based notion in higher ed that a history teacher or a music teacher is paid less than an accounting professor or an engineering professor, is a pretty well-established concept. And it may be that K-12 teachers don't like it. I also think higher ed people in music and history and low-paid fields don't like it that much either. But it's sort of a fact of life. It's way that the market has pushed those fields. And it seems to me, what teachers like and what they don't like is one dimension of the politics of what kind of pay plans we'll get, but others are, what works and what do we need to do in terms of school systems making them work better. The Goldhaber data from Washington State also breaks it down a lot by the context of teachers. There's some very good information that I'd encourage you to take a look at in terms of whether they trust the principal, the grade level, and other things that we think are important in that in terms of how they think about it. And Goldhaber also makes the point that local context is critically important. He cites some other studies that suggest that there's a little bit less a little bit more pay-for-performance type plans in areas that have weaker union support, and also lots of other studies have shown that private and charter schools tend to use it more. So again, trying to get at the politics of why we get pay-for-performance in some cases and why we don't in others. He suggests some strategies, sort of political strategies, which are to make it more palatable potentially to teachers and to teachers' unions, which involve opt-in strategies, positive sum strategies, many of which ProComp has utilized as well. He has a lot of cautions. We've heard a lot of the technical cautions already in different contexts, I think. One of the really interesting questions I think he raises is what we do and don't know about the group versus individual issue that I mentioned in a question yesterday. He also highlights the fact that we need better systems in school districts to make these plans actually work. And it's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be free. There may be efficiency benefits in the long run from having better teachers and rewarding the right teachers and retaining the right teachers and attracting the right teachers, but in the short run, it costs money, and implementation is difficult. And again, from my own experience with ProComp and looking a little bit at the early implementation, it's really hard for districts to simply get the data systems, the IT mechanisms, so that it's relatively easy to pay teachers on the single salary schedule because you know what they're making and you can figure that out a year in advance. But if they're getting a bonus late in the year based on various measures that are coming in, you need to cut a check that does that. And even for a fairly large district like Denver, it's been quite difficult to get all of its different systems talking to one another. I think it's also actually been catalytically positive for them because it was something that had to maybe happen anyway in terms of organizational impacts, but it's important. So finally, Goldhaber makes the big point that implementation matters, and it clearly does. And if we get a bunch of new experiments in pay for performance and they're implemented poorly, cheaply, not well thought through, we'll probably potentially do more damage than positive. The Ryan paper, which is different from I think everything else we've seen and heard so far in the last 2 days, because it's a careful legal analysis of the legal issues involved in pay for performance, and very well done, very interesting to me. I'm not a lawyer, I don't play one on TV, so I'm not sure I'm representing everything correctly, but generally I think Ryan suggests that there's few or no major legal barriers to proceeding with pay for performance. And on most aspects of pay for performance, the law and the current policy direction go pretty much hand in hand, and that's probably a good thing. He then surveys several aspects of law that may or may not be problematic, and first looking at the kind of individual rights issues, and obviously any well-developed pay for performance plan is going to have to deal with discrimination, substantive due process, procedural due process type issues, and the Ryan paper goes very carefully through what that means in the context of teacher compensation and the law that's developed around that. But it seems to come out with a pretty confident notion that if you do a smart pay for performance plan, you can probably avoid a lot of lawsuits from people saying that they should have gotten a bonus and they didn't, and those kinds of concerns. He then looks carefully at federal law and issues at the federal level, particularly asking the question if the federal government wants to incentivize more states and districts to do pay for performance, particularly with TIF fund type money, but possibly other things. Do they have the legal authority and right to do that? And mostly, works through that pretty carefully and finds that it's probably not a problem. There's some parallels to the kind of question of is NCLB an unfunded mandate, and is that a problem in terms of carrots and sticks from the federal government? But ultimately, the federal government, if they're offering money, districts and states don't have to take it, and if they want to take it to implement pay for performance, they can probably do that. The most important question, I think the thorniest legal question that he raises, is around state level sort of top-down imposed pay for performance plans onto districts, and whether or not that can be legally problematic with collective bargaining issues. And the answer seems to be there's a ton of variation. As he looks carefully through the states, there are some states where that might be a problem based on the Constitution, the statutory interpretation, the precedents involved in legal issues in those states. In others, it's probably pretty doable. But again, a lot of it has to do with a kind of Clinton-esque question about what the word is means, about what the word wages means. That seems to be, whether you can apply bonuses on top of that, and what that means in the collective bargaining context and the state legal context. And the bottom line seems to be that there is a lot of variation by state. It's going to vary depending on state law, and the safer bet legally than if you're in a state that might be problematic is to work with the unions and the collective bargaining agreement to make this work well. So a couple of quick final comments as my time is running down. This destructive competition idea it occurred to me. I used to study regulatory policy, and the airlines, trucking, and railroads, when they were deregulated in the 1980s and even back to the Great Depression, used to argue that if they had to compete and they weren't sort of had cartel regulation protection, that they would cut costs, they would cut safety, it would be destructive, and they'd go out of business, and we'd have no airlines and trucking left. That argument didn't seem to hold up very well, and it seems at least similar to me about the argument that individuals, if they're rewarded with individual pay for performance bonuses for teaching, will kind of destroy their colleagues' lab experiment kind of idea. Instead, what was found in the early evaluation of ProComp was actually that the collegiality increased, in part because it was a positive sum environment and everyone could get bonuses, that there was the ability for teachers to help each other and figure out how to do a better job and how to get the bonuses, which is probably a good thing. I think all these papers point out that we have to think about the importance of the different levels of government. I think there was a good comment about that earlier in the international context. Ultimately, all education policy really is state and local, and I think all these papers make that point pretty well, but there's certainly money and technical assistance and other things that can come, or data requirements that can come from higher levels of government that are important. And as I've thought about pay for performance, I see the technical issues and the political issues, and it's sometimes useful to separate them out completely, but I think also they're not separable completely. The technical issues affect the politics. And if teachers and teachers' unions are not happy with the kind of technical solutions that are out there, or don't think they're fair, or have some of the other legitimate concerns that the Hannaway-Rotherham paper raised, then they're going to be politically opposed to moving forward with these kinds of plans, and obviously that's going to prevent more experimentation and more activity. So I guess one question that I hope maybe the other members of the panel can address is, does it make sense, if you're an advocate of pay for performance, to advocate a kind of light version of pay for performance and say, we can't do the student achievement and stuff well enough yet to tie huge amounts of money to people, and we're not even sure that would work. So we should have a portfolio, we should have a positive sum environment, we should have opt-in, and all the things that make teachers feel comfortable to kind of get the process moving more. Whereas if we push for a different kind of heavier pay for performance type of plan, it might become politically problematic. So I do think the stars are a bit aligned, and we're at the beginning of an S-curve of diffusion, of innovation, of all these exciting experiments, but obviously we have a lot to learn and a lot of issues and barriers to deal with. So thanks to the paper writers, and thanks to the Vanderbilt, and I look forward to more comments.
Okay, this being the last panel, I want to start by thanking Jim and Matt for an absolutely terrific conference on pay for performance. As the director of the sister center, Calder, however, I do feel a lot of performance pressure now because this has been such a terrific effort. I'm going to quickly try to address three questions. The first question is, why is there pressure now for pay for performance? Secondly, why is there resistance for pay for performance? And thirdly, where is there room for a deal? And some of this is going to be somewhat repetitious with what we've been talking about, but I think it's good for a wrap-up. Why is there pressure for pay for performance? Well, I think the first reason is because of recent findings, and some of those findings, I might brag, are Calder findings as well as findings of other researchers that show that there is tremendous, that teachers are the most important factor affecting student achievement, the most important school factor, and that there is tremendous variation in impact across teachers. So once you see those findings, you think, geez, we got to do something about that. So what's the something? Well, if you go back to organizations and the organization theory literature, there are three basic ways in which organizations try to control or direct the behavior of their members. One, they try to regulate tasks. Two, they try to monitor task behavior or work behavior. And three, they pay for performance. They reward you for output. Well, if you look at education, none of these are used. In most organizations, if you go to the organization sociology literature and you go across organizations, you can see how these different mechanisms of control tend to be substitutes for each other depending upon the nature of the work. But again, in education, none of them are used to any great extent, or certainly not to the extent that we would expect. And I might add, for good reason. So this isn't necessarily a damning of education. I think there are good reasons. And let me just go through a couple of these. First, in terms of regulating tasks. If you want to regulate tasks, then those tasks have to be tasks that can be well specified, and tasks in which the connection to the ends are well understood. Under those conditions, then it makes sense to regulate tasks. Now, this isn't necessarily low-level work. If you think of doctors, there are procedures, medical procedures that are followed where the means-ends relationship are well understood, and doctors follow those procedures. If you think of airline pilots, they go through a checklist before they take off. There are procedures. This is very complex work, but work in which we understand pretty well. In education, teaching is both complex and highly variable. So it's complex work, and exactly what the teacher should do depends on context conditions in that classroom, who the kids are, and more than that, it's a dynamic relationship. So a good teacher on his or her feet is constantly playing back and forth between the reaction of the kids. So it probably isn't a very good mechanism of organizational control for teachers. You don't want to highly specify and regulate tasks. Monitoring, which is a second way in which organizations tend to direct behavior. And you find this especially in craft-type work. Think of carpenters, for example, where there's a supervisor checking how things are being done and sharing expertise. In education, this is very costly. Teachers work in classrooms. In order to do any sort of effective monitoring, it would be very costly to do this across classrooms. If you go to some relatively recent data, the most recent version of SAS, and you ask teachers how much is your work controlled, they report their work is not controlled. So just to give you a few quick statistics, again, this is from SAS. The question is, to what extent do you have control over the following areas? And what I'm going to give you is the percent that report a moderate or great extent of control. 2/3 report moderate or great extent of control over selecting instructional materials. 2/3 over selecting course content. Over 90%, about 95% on teaching techniques. About 95% on evaluating students. So teachers themselves, and remember this is after No Child Left Behind, are reporting a high level of control over what goes on in the classroom. So it's not happening much. When you go to monitoring, and when I was trying to get a feel for what goes on in terms of monitoring, I went to Kate Walsh's database on the teacher contracts in the largest 50 states. And it turns out that the modal amount of time that teachers are observed according to contract for tenured teachers is about 45 minutes per year. A little bit more, twice as much, 3 times as much, 2 or 3 visits on non-tenured teachers. Well, if you sort of multiply this out, this means that tenured teachers are observed 0.08% of their teaching time. Non-tenured teachers are observed 0.23% of their teaching time. So, I mean, I'm not a sampling statistician, but if you go back to my earlier comment about how this is complex work, it's highly variable work, it's very context dependent, I suspect most sampling statisticians would be somewhat uncomfortable with that level of observation in order to get a reliable estimate of quality of what's going on in the classroom. So clearly that's not going on. So we have a situation where we know there's huge variation across teachers. We know that there's very little that's being done to direct behavior, in traditional ways anyway. And now we have all these new data systems. So all of a sudden the costs are dramatically reduced for estimating teacher effects based on these large data systems. And so everyone is sort of jumping on the bandwagon on this. The first 2 are really not happening for a good extent. The third one, all of a sudden, is now possible. So that's, I think, why there's the big push now and why we may be at the beginning of this S-curve on this. Why the resistance? Well, there's some good reasons for the resistance. First, this is a big shift in the implicit employment contract between teachers and their employers. When most teachers now in the labor market first took their jobs, they took the job under certain implicit assumptions about what the nature of their work would be. And that was that they were going to be fairly autonomous in their classroom. I mean, and all of a sudden the game is being shifted on them. And you naturally, this would happen in any organization when you shift that that implicit employment contract. And so we're getting a lot of resistance. And again, and I think Dan will be talking about how the resistance and the pushback is greater for the older teachers that took the job under one set of terms than the newer teachers who are seeing these changes happening and are becoming employed under a different set of implicit assumptions. So that's one reason. Secondly, unions are resisting this. Now, teachers' unions traditionally were, begun in the 60s, really, or certainly grew in the 60s, and modeled themselves on industrial unions, where a big part of the objective of unions, and at that time for very good reason, was to protect teachers from arbitrary treatment of supervisors, of principals. And so there was traditionally an effort to sort of keep the administrators at bay. And they resisted any form of differentiation of teachers because that basically weakens the power of the union. If you can bargain for the full collectivity, then you have greater power. So there's been a traditional and predictable resistance for any sort of differentiation among the unions. There are also other reasons which are not political but are good reasons, I can wrap up quickly, which have been mentioned, that unions are also resisting. Distortions, not all teachers benefit. There's a huge fairness issue. Principals have an effect. Teachers are working with different principals. Unclear, you'd have no control, for the most part, over the kids who are going to be in your classroom. There's the nature of the task. There's all the estimation stuff that we've been talking about over the last 2 days. So there are some real issues about fairness. So there's real good reason for resistance. Is there room for a deal? The first question. We answered this by going back to the 5 major plans that are in place, and there seem to be conditions right now, and Paul was talking about these, where there is room for a deal, and how far these can be pushed over time and what we can learn from them over time, I think is where we are right now. 5 basic conditions. Unions are in all the ones that are operating right now. Unions have been involved in the planning and implementation. Teacher schools, districts elect to participate. Multiple bases for pay bonus, so the fraction that's due to student performance gains is actually relatively small. The bonus is on top of a protected base salary, and the startups of these tend to come not out of existing operating funds, which would have made it a zero-sum game, but additional funds coming in so that teachers, at least in the beginning during these pilot years, are better off. I think there's going to be a whole new sort of political dynamic going on when these become institutionalized and get further beyond the pilot stage. They've done it in Denver, but with a new tax levy. So yes, I think it's taking off. I think there's going to be no way stopping it. I think there's room for a deal, but I think it's going to be perhaps a slower incremental learning process than what a lot of advocates would want.
I've got 10 minutes. Tap me when I hit 8. So let me begin by thanking Paul for some terrific comments and the folks at Vanderbilt, because this has been a really interesting conference, and you all who are the hardcore of the hardcore to stick it out to the last day. I, like Paul Peterson, was going to shirk and not have any slides until I got here and saw that there were some authors that had slides, and then I was sort of shamed into doing slides. So I don't know if there's... I do have some slides, okay. So I kind of, on the fly, put some slides together, which I may or may not use. I want to start with a comment that Derek Neal made about the master's pay premium. Because I think it's interesting that, I mean, for those of you that don't know, you get typically a $5,000 bump up in your compensation if you have a master's degree, and it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you get the degree, and it doesn't matter what the degree is in. So if you look at teachers, a great many of them, I don't know if it's the majority or plurality, but a great many of them get a master's in educational administration. And many more people get masters in educational administration than there are administrative slots. And there's not, I would say, there's in fact, outside of a couple of specific instances, there's not evidence that having a master's degree makes somebody either makes someone a more effective teacher or predicts that somebody is in fact going to be a more effective teacher, and that there's pretty uniform agreement among researchers at least that that's the case. And it's not new. This is not a new finding, except if you look all across school systems, everybody has the master's pay premium. So I think that if we haven't been able to tackle that low-hanging fruit, it suggests what a sort of tough nut pay for performance is and will be. And I think that that's a good thing to keep in the back of your mind if you are a pay for performance advocate, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get us to the point of doing good pay for performance systems. So the other thing I want to say, just by way of laying the groundwork, is that there was a lot of experimentation with pay for performance right after A Nation at Risk came out, 25 years ago. And it seemed like that was in vogue in the early, mid-'80s and then kind of faded away. And I would argue that we are all here today because of value added. And we're here today, and because people have determined that, look, there's a lot of variation in teacher effectiveness. But primarily because of value added, because policymakers, I believe, see value added as a means of implementing an objective system of pay for performance that sidesteps a lot of the issues, the political issues that come up around pay for performance. Right? We can do it and sort of take it out of anybody's hands, the discretion out of anybody's hands. And I think the conversation that we had today suggests that it's not going to be the silver bullet. It's not going to do it. And that there are some reasons you wouldn't actually want value added to be the sole way that you would determine who was going to get pay for performance. Some of them were discussed. Some of the technical issues that come up are really specific. Even if you had a perfect system for identifying teachers, if you were going to try and do something policy-wise where you said, I'm going to reward teachers that fall into the top decile, the top quartile, you're making a cutoff decision, right? And there's no statistician in the world who's going to tell you that a teacher who is at the 79th percentile is really going to be different, statistically speaking, from a teacher that falls at the 81st percentile. So that's a problem. It doesn't get around the issues that come up that are cultural issues about doing pay for performance. I don't personally think that means we ought not to do it. I think that the evidence on pay for performance suggests that, I'm like way afield of what my paper's actually on, but the evidence suggests that they're either 5 minutes, all right. There's not much harm and perhaps positive effects in other countries and the very scant evidence that we have here. But it's not clear how to do it. It's not clear how to do it, and it's not clear that we would even want to use value added. In the examples that were raised from India and Africa, those were pay for performance plans that didn't actually use a value added system, and yet it still seemed, at least in the case of India, that there was an impact. So I do think that it makes sense to do some experimenting. All right, so why don't we see more experimenting than we actually do? Well, it's the evil teachers unions, right? I mean, that is the view that lots of people have, and I think that it's absolutely legitimate that the teachers unions tend to oppose, in lots of ways, oppose pay for performance systems. And if you look at the work by Terry Moe, Terry says, look, even in places where the teachers unions aren't out and out opposing it, in low turnout school board elections, the teachers can have a lot of influence on the outcomes of those elections and basically determine who their ultimate bosses are. Okay, but if you look across the United States in places where teachers unions are not all that strong, it doesn't look like there is much of a difference. There's just a slight difference, but not a real difference in the pay structures that we see in strong union states, weak union states, strong union districts, weak union districts. And so I think it's wrong to lay all the blame at the foot of the teachers' unions. And I'm not going to put it up here, but I would just say that the teachers' unions, maybe I will put it up here. No, I won't. I've already screwed up the presentation. The teachers' unions, their positions on pay for performance, they really do reflect how teachers feel about pay for performance. So in the survey in Washington that we did, we found that 83% of teachers opposed pay for performance when you asked very narrowly, do you support pay for teachers to get a bonus if they produce test scores that are larger than test scores of otherwise comparable students. And you get, so the more specific you get, which you really need to get policy-wise, the more opposition you get. If you ask someone, should teachers get rewarded for better performance? Well, then the surveys tend to be a little bit more mushy about how people feel. But it is not uniform. So different teachers feel differently. If you're in a school where you really trust your principal, you're more likely to be supportive. If you're a younger teacher, you're more likely to be supportive. So this just sort of echoes some of the things that Jane talked about, that if we're thinking about actually trying some of these policies, thinking about the context that we try the policy in, and thank you, whoever did that, the context that we try the policy in, and who gets targeted with the policy, I think is actually quite important. So, aside from the teachers' union, aside from how the teachers feel, there are a lot of things about the local, how am I doing on time? 1 minute. The local districts and elections in local districts that I think are real hurdles to implementing pay for performance. There are capacity issues. There's who the comparison group issues are. There's a safety in doing what has been done for, 80 years, 50 years. And there's kind of a constant churning. There are a lot of political reasons that are not teachers' union alone reasons for implementing change. Is the bottom line. I don't have time to go into all of them. So I just want to conclude with the difference between today and 25 years ago in my mind. We know a lot more about how to assess educational programs today than we did 25 years ago. So I think that even if we don't get to a point where we have the ideal value-added system, trying things and assessing whether or not they make a difference, ideally in the way that they did it in Africa and India, but realistically just putting it in place and seeing if we can see any kind of impact is a good thing to do and fundamentally necessary to figure out whether this can matter. And I do think that we're not comparing some ideal against pay for performance. We're comparing a system that doesn't look like it's working all that well today to get what we want out of schools with some alternative. I'll conclude there.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Matt and Jim for inviting me and Paul for his comments. I've been thinking a lot about incentives, obviously, and was thinking that saving the legal issues for the very last panel is not a great incentive to keep you all here. I admire your stamina. I am delighted to be here, in no small part because there aren't many other lawyers around. That might be a relief to you as well. It's not that I have anything against lawyers, it's just a treat because when lawyers or law professors get together, they talk about anything but the law. If you go to a conference that consists of law professors, you'll hear discussions about history, economics, psychology, sociology, almost no discussion about the law. So it's a real treat to actually be able to get to talk about the law itself. My goal in the paper was to talk about the legal issues that surround pay for performance, and specifically to address whether there are any serious legal obstacles to adopting these programs. To cut to the chase, the only really serious open question is whether teacher union consent is required before these programs are adopted, for reasons I'll explain. This is obviously an important question because given the opposition of teacher unions, if consent is required, that's going to make it more difficult for these programs to get off the ground. So the way to think about this is to think about first, whether governments have the authority to create these programs, and second, once they are created, do they have to be structured in a particular way to protect individual rights? So on the first question, in thinking about authority, it also makes sense to break the level of governments down. So if you think about the federal government first, can the federal government encourage states to create pay-per-performance programs? Now, you might think, well, of course not, because the federal government, after all, is a government of enumerated powers, although it's often easy to miss that, given how much Washington does. But the answer is more complicated. The Constitution doesn't say anything about education and does not give the federal government direct control over education. So it's probably the case that the federal government could not order states to adopt pay-for-performance programs. But the Constitution does grant states the authority to spend in the general welfare. Now, there's been a debate over this, or there was a debate, it's been settled now, about whether the spending power grants Congress powers above and beyond those powers that are enumerated in the Constitution. Or put differently, whether Congress, by spending money and attaching conditions to spending, can accomplish indirectly what it can't accomplish directly. And the long and short of it is that the court has decided that yes, Congress has the authority to attach conditions to spending that go above and beyond what Congress could directly command. So if you've been wondering why is the No Child Left Behind Act constitutional, well, the reason why it's constitutional is because it's a spending program. It's basically conditions attached to spending. Now, there are limits on the conditions that Congress can attach to spending programs, but those limits are essentially weak to non-existent. The spending has to be for the general welfare, which is an easy requirement to meet, and the court has indicated is not really judicially enforceable. Congress can't, when it attaches strings, ask states to violate the Constitution, which is kind of a no-brainer and usually pretty easy to meet. Congress is not in the habit of saying, we'll give you this money if you deny First Amendment rights to all people who live in a particular neighborhood. The third requirement is that the requirements have to be clear. This is sometimes harder to meet. In fact, there was a recent case about the No Child Left Behind Act decided by the Sixth Circuit where the court held that the federal government wasn't clear enough in terms of the obligations it was imposing on states when it enacted the No Child Left Behind Act. But provided that Congress is clear in terms of the deal that it's offering states, that shouldn't be a problem. The conditions also have to be germane to the spending, meaning that you can't condition you can't provide conditions that have nothing to do with the purpose of the spending, but this is also an easy condition to meet because the court tends to look at the purpose behind the spending at a very high level of generality. So in the leading case on the topic, South Dakota versus Dole, the court said that it was okay for Congress to condition highway funding on an agreement by the states to raise their drinking age. And you might think, well, what's the connection? And the connection is highway safety. It's less likely that there are going to be drunk drivers if you raise the drinking age, or at least that was the idea. But that gives you a sense of how tenuous the connection can be. The last is that the conditions can only be encouraging. The federal government can't coerce states into accepting the conditions. In theory, this might be a pretty serious restriction given that oftentimes in reality states can't turn away the money. So if you think about Title I and why states haven't simply turned down Title I funding and said to heck with No Child Left Behind Act, it's because they find it very difficult to turn down the money. Yet the court has held that it's quite difficult to prove coercion rather than temptation or encouragement, in large part because states, if they wanted to, in theory, could walk away and raise taxes. So although in theory that could be a serious restriction, in reality it's not. And you can see this just by virtue of the fact that no one has said the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act is unconstitutional, even though it's difficult for states to, it's difficult not to think of that in some ways as coercive on the states. So the federal government, if it wanted to, could certainly, and has in the Teacher Incentive Fund, encourage states to adopt pay-for-performance programs, and the proposals to do so in the No Child Left Behind Act reauthorization are certainly constitutional. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that if Congress wanted to, it could, quote-unquote, encourage states to adopt a national curriculum simply by making that a condition of federal funding. Now, at the state level, the key states are not governments of enumerated powers. They can act from the perspective of federal constitutional law in the interest of the general welfare. So to look for limits on state authority or on local authority, you have to look to state law. And here the key law is our collective bargaining laws. Now, it's difficult to generalize because not all states have collective bargaining laws, and the laws that exist in every state are somewhat different. But the majority of states do have these laws, and what they require in general is that local governments have to bargain with representatives of local employees. And they have to bargain specifically about wages, terms, and other conditions of employment. And here's where we get to the legalese. So the big question with regard to performance pay is whether it constitutes a wage. If it does constitute a wage, then it is the subject of mandatory bargaining, which in effect means that teachers' unions have to consent to the program. If it's not a wage, then districts can impose the program unilaterally. And unfortunately, I have to give you an on the one hand, on the other hand answer, which will make you appreciate why Harry Truman once said he wanted a one-handed lawyer. On the one hand, there are some decisions that suggest, as you might just think intuitively, that performance pay is a wage. It's pay for performance. It's pay for work. It acts like a duck. It quacks like a duck. It is a duck. On the other hand, and this is why studying the law is so entertaining, some courts, when they see something that walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, call it a fish. And so other courts have said that no, performance pay is not a wage, in part because it's more like a bonus. It's not given in exchange for any more work. The program might be voluntary. Part of the difficulty is that there is a dilemma when it comes to collective bargaining with regard to public employees. On the one hand, the issues are very private and important to the employees themselves. On the other hand, they might involve important issues of public policy. And so oftentimes you see courts sort of torn between the idea that this is just a matter of disagreement among employees and their employer, and so it should be decided by collective bargaining. And you see other courts saying, well, it just seems inconsistent with democratic decision-making that a policy that affects the public and not just the teachers or employees is decided through collective bargaining. And I think that dilemma explains why there's been some difference of opinion. But as it stands now, it's unclear how courts would decide this issue if and when confronted with it. And therefore, it's unclear, and it's got to be decided state by state whether performance pay has to be is subject to mandatory bargaining laws. Now, even if it is, that doesn't mean that you can't create the programs. It just means that the teachers' unions have to be involved. Okay, so that's the authority part of it. Now, in my last 30 seconds, I'll talk about the individual rights. No one cares about individual rights anyway, so 30 seconds to talk about. So there are two rights at issue: due process and anti-discrimination. There's a really curious question about whether you're entitled to due process protection, but I'll spare you that. Suffice it to say that if due process protections apply, both as a matter of state and federal law, what it basically means is that the program has to provide notice and an opportunity to be heard. That is, and it can't be completely arbitrary. That is, teachers have to have some notice that performance pay is going to be used. The criteria have to be fairly well articulated, and teachers have to have some mechanism to contest a decision not to award them merit pay. It's not a very high hurdle. It's not as if the discussion is at the level that we've heard today among statisticians about whether a measurement is valid. It's basically, is this just a loopy program where principals just decide on the color of someone's hair whether they get performance pay or not? The last is anti-discrimination, and this is just a basic principle. Performance pay, obviously, can't be used to discriminate on the basis other than performance, and in particular, it can't be used to discriminate on the basis of certain protected characteristics: race, religion, sex, disability, and the like. Clearly, it can't be used intentionally for that purpose, but a number of federal laws protect against policies that have a disparate impact. And what that means is that if the policy is used and it turns out that a disproportionate number of male teachers are receiving performance pay, this school might have the burden of explaining why it is that a disproportionate number of men receive merit pay. They'd have an opportunity to provide a reason that is not, well, we like men. It would have to be something related to the merit, but obviously it opens up an opportunity for for litigation. The last point, and this is something Paul mentioned, there's sort of a happy story here insofar as if you think teachers' unions represent the views of teachers, and if you believe that you can't have a successful merit pay program without teachers buying into the program, the law is sort of pushing in the same direction. You're in the safest spot legally if you get teacher union consent. You're also in the safest spot legally if the program has fairly objective criteria. Notice that it's going to be used in an opportunity for teachers to contest the findings. All of which I think would be ingredients of a wise performance pay policy, independent of the legal requirements. Anyway, thanks. Sorry if I went over.
A working paper and the PowerPoint slides used in this presentation are available on the National Center on Performance Incentive website.